A very good afternoon and welcome to this room. My name is Raymond Mujuni. I'll be your moderator for the day. Our conversation here today is really the Global South perspectives on the Ukrainian war, and I think that's up there on the screen. You'll be able to see it. I have a very exciting panel right before me. I have Joan Chira, who is from Zambia, leads the Free Press Initiative. I have Shvasti Rao, who is from India, is an associate professor. I have Mr. Bakari, who is a PhD in international relations, but also from the Timbuktu Institute. And I have Mr. Fernando, who is from the Argentinian Deputy of Chambers, I think, and heads the Foreign Affairs Committee. So it's a very broad panel. I hope it represents the Global South in some form, manner, or way, and we'll have that conversation. But before we start, I was tasked to ask you guys 3 questions, and you can raise your hands based on the 3 questions so that we can understand where the room falls on this matter. So the first question is, since the start of the invasion, how many of you have noticed Ukrainian strategic communications on the war in your country? Raise your hands slightly higher. We need to be able to count them. Since the start of the war, how many of you have noticed Ukraine's strategic messaging become visible in your country? And then my second question is, how many of you have noticed Russia's strategic messaging visible in your country? Oh, wow, that's almost everyone. The people whose hands are not up, I'd be very interested to find out which countries those are. And then, very finally, if I could ask you this, in the strategic messaging, how many of you have noticed that messaging being Russia versus the West in the framing of the war? Is it Russia versus the West, or is it Russia versus Ukraine? Russia versus the West. Anyone who is from a country where it's Russia versus Ukraine? Okay, and that's a good place. So we're going to start this panel really from that point. First of all, thank you so much, my panelists, for accepting to speak in this panel. We already agreed that perspectives are really large, they are varied, but maybe I'll start with you, Shvasti, because you're from India, and for you the war is slightly more closer to home because you have strategic dependency as India or on Russia. Yeah. What's the Indian perspective on the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, thank you, Raymond. It's an honor to be speaking in this very illustrious panel. It was just about 2 or 3 weeks ago when I and Raymond found each other together on the Kyiv Express. We were going together to attend the Yes Forum at Kyiv, and we had this very, very substantive discussion on the war, etc. So it's very, very nice to be back and you to be moderating it. So I feel very good about that. Now, as far as thanks for also beginning with me, because I understand that India's position is something which is a lot of times not understood well enough and then not analyzed well enough. And I feel that India's position on the war is also something which is somehow made to look as if it is only about the moral paradigm, okay? And I think here is where I think my task is to make you understand how to really make sense of a country as big as India, as geographically relevant as India, as young as India, as populous in India, and end of the day, it's a democracy too. Now, if I may just borrow this metaphor, I'm sure all of you here know about this band called Guns N' Roses, okay? So if you want to make sense of India's position on the war and what is impacting us, it's guns and oil. Guns, because India has been dependent on Russian weapons, first Soviet weapons and then Russian weapons. At least there was a time when about 80% of our entire, weaponry came from Soviet-era platforms, and we continue to have reliance on that. So that is the guns part. The second I said is oil, because when the war started, what we saw is that while our orders are not really coming anymore because Russia became so much involved with the war in Ukraine, and we had already started to diversify away from Russian weapons because we knew and we identified that as a core dependency. So from a decade, we were trying to make many efforts to diversify away, and we had been, having successes there. We saw that before the war in Russia and Ukraine began, we were getting less than 1% of our oil imports from Russia. That is not the place where we got our oil from. We were getting our oil from the Middle Eastern countries. initially, we were also getting our oil from Venezuela and Iran. And you know that after Donald Trump put sanctions, of course, we had to diversify our way to other GCC countries. But after the war, we saw this opportunity where Russia spoke to us and said that because we have to allow for a rerouting to happen, Russia is going to give us discounts. And India, you should know that India is dependent. Every day, India requires about 4.5 to 500,000, 5 million barrels per day, which is a lot. 5 million barrels per day we require. And out of that, almost 40% we started getting from Russia because of the discounts. So that is the landscape that you can probably understand in terms of dependencies. One was a dependency that we were trying to lessen in terms of arms. Another was a dependency that we started to have more and more. And as a result, what you have today is that before the war in Ukraine began, we had less than $10 billion worth of bilateral trade. But after the war and in the last 3 years, we have had close to $70 billion worth of trade because of these huge, humongous oil imports. And I gave you figures also. And out of the 5 million that we require every day, we have now started importing almost 40%, 45% from Russia alone. And that has created a huge trade deficit for us, okay? So this is, two dependencies that I can sort of start with. The other was... and of course, before I go on to other things, the second dependency, of course, is something which is creating a lot of trouble for us now because Donald Trump has made the oil imports the centerpiece of his foreign policy towards India. India finds this very unfair because, truth be told, we have been trying very, very hard to diversify away from Russian arms. I think you should also know that India has not put a new order with Russia after the war in Ukraine has begun because we have been waiting for our S-400s to arrive and we still are waiting for the two of those that have not come. And we don't know when it will come because, the deadlines are now getting pushed further, by Russia. So these are the two main important things. The other thing that not many people talk about was that India is also one of the largest importers of Russian fertilizer. And as a country that is dependent, still largely, 70% of India is agriculture-based. So those kind of dependencies cannot be substituted upon, just overnight. So that was the third factor. And the fourth factor when the war in Ukraine began was we had 22,000 Indian students studying medicine in Ukraine. And we had to create humanitarian corridors, and in fact, at a very huge level, at the government Prime Minister's level, we had to launch an operation to actually get our students back to India. And that was also, I would say a humongous task. And I was myself working for the MOD think tank then, so I was, involved there. So just to sort of wrap things, when you ask about critical dependencies, what COVID has taught us, of course, that you have to build more resilience. What Russia-Ukraine war has also taught us that you have to build certainly more resilience. But as far as India's response to that is concerned, I think when you are sitting in the West and sort of criticizing India, there is certain criticism that I totally stand by. But there are other things where I think a nuanced conversation is really going to take the conversation forward.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I want to bring in Bakari in here now for the African soil. A lot of resistance at the voting level particularly. The countries that have resisted condemning Russia for the conflict are Sahel belt countries. And one of those countries, of course, Mali, where the Timbuktu Institute is. Just help us understand, is there a strategic security dependency that Mali might have that might impact its perspective on the war?
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here, and I thank the Forum 2000 to invite me here to hear some African voices. I'm not from Mali, I'm from Senegal, but Timbuktu is a symbol of the open Africa and the symbol of this age where all the world are coming to learn from the Africans. That's why I choose this name. But I work in the broader Sahel. Yeah. I think that, first of all, to make the West African or the Sahelian people to understand this conflict, we have to solve another conflict. This conflict is the conflict of perception of the conflict. The conflict of perception of this conflict between international glasses and local visions, between international conception and local perception. Because the first obstacle of this understanding was, okay, many of people did not hear about Ukraine until this war. That's the first. The second thing is also the the involvement of NATO, if you know the very bad record, I'm sorry, of NATO in the perception of West African and Sahelian, where they bombed Libya, and it was the cause and the beginning of the broader conflict in the Sahel with terrorism and everything. The third thing also is also, I think, okay, we do not heard a lot from the Ukrainian. We do understand this conflict just from the conception of the European Union. And you know also the diplomatical and political record for European Union. And I am very happy to come here because these 2 days I heard a lot from the Ukrainians themselves. From this conflict, from my perception, moved from a geopolitical conflict to a human conflict. I heard here something about the human dimension of this conflict. I heard about something that makes sense in my perspective as an African, an occupied countries, killing people, killing kids, and making people going from their country. I fully, as an African, understand this situation. I think that the missing link in the communication of this conflict was to hear about the Ukrainian stories themselves and the Ukrainian narrative we do not know and we can ignore. If you have to look to this conflict from the perspective to NATO, okay, NATO is, what is NATO? If you ask what is NATO to, I have some friend in NATO, but if you ask to the, for people, what is NATO? Okay, there are those people who are bomb Libya, and they cause all this conflict and terrorism in the Sahel. They will say that, the first. What is European Union? And from the Malian or the Nigerian, European Union is first friends. If you may know now, this conflict between the Malian and the French. This is some obstacle to tackle, if I may say, and also to how to extract this conflict, the understanding of the conflict from a geopolitical conflict between the West and the East, between the Warsaw Pact and the others, to a human dimension, making the Africans themselves. Yeah. And finally, I think that the Ukrainian diplomat had not a very good communication in the beginning of the conflict. For example, in Senegal, the first communication about the conflict was, okay, the Ukrainian embassy is recruiting people who go to fight in Ukraine. They say, okay, what is this? And I think that, yeah, so we need, I don't believe a lot on the global south. I don't understand what is this. But in Africa, yes, because inside the global south, there is some domination from each to others. That's why I don't agree with this word. Yes. In West Africa, yes, we need to hear more about this, knowing that the Russian disinformation is very effective when they are working in Mali, in Niger, and in Burkina Faso. And we need, from now, and I will be one of the spokesmen of Ukrainian people, I hear here, from now, we need to hear about the conflict from the Ukrainians themselves, from their story and their narrative in order to that makes sense for our domination. We know we are colonized. Occupation, we know what is this. We were occupied by some European power, but and in the meantime, we know how people are suffering from war and from occupation. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you so much, Bakary. I was going to bring Fernando next, but I now have to bring Joan in first before Fernando. And Joan, the question that I want to ask you is the strategic messaging and narratives that we're receiving on the war on the African continent. Very few Africans know that Ukraine is fighting on its own land, defending its own land. Very few Africans have interacted with Ukrainian information, with Ukrainian civilians fighting back. Why might that be the case? And how has Russia succeeded in the sphere of information war on the African continent in a way that Ukraine hasn't succeeded?
Yeah, thanks, Raymond. And I think let me first just recognize the fact that my brother from Senegal actually raised something that has been on my mind, which is the move from the geopolitical context, which I think he got from the Ukrainians that he spoke to a human context, which is, I think, one of the key things that we need to begin to bring out as a result of what has been going on in Ukraine, based on the aggression by Russia. When you look at what you just asked in terms of the information power or the narratives that Russia has been pushing, I think it's all about them also taking advantage of the fact that there are a number of some African countries that have been dependent on Russia for a number of things. And I'll give you an example of my country, for instance, Zambia, that has had a long-standing relationship with Russia in terms of education support. So we do have a lot of students that go to Russia to study. And also some other support in agriculture. And there was actually mention of how that has affected the fertilizer supply for India. And I think that's exactly the case for Zambia as well. So there's that push to try and maintain those relations without breaking so much what has been existing diplomatically. So in short, there's that slow move where Russia is getting an upper hand and also finding ways in which they can even work with some African media through organizing visits into Russia, which clearly are meant to, sell their own agenda in terms of what has been going on and masking everything else that is happening in terms of their aggression on Russia. So that's been one of those softer ways of trying to have an upper hand in terms of that information. But of course, looking at it from another angle, I think it's also a chance for ourselves, myself being a journalist, to sort of step in and find a way of coming together to begin to bring out that information that is being hidden, that they wouldn't want anybody to know about, via all the platforms they have been using to push a lot of misinformation and disinformation deliberately to mislead people so that they shouldn't understand exactly what is going on and who really is at fault, when we know clearly that the aggression that is going on there is something that was started by them and not necessarily as a result of something that came from Ukraine, because it was unprovoked. And unfortunately for the African context, it also does set a very bad precedent, because right now we may slowly begin to see some African countries that will think real power is all about, pushing for legitimacy in the global affairs than respecting the will of the people and respecting democracy. A number of them will begin to copy and think, well, if this can be done elsewhere, then I think we are also in a better position to push and consolidate what Russia is trying to push on their own. And mostly, you see that even the approach for some of those countries is about them having to, have ties to the history of colonialism in most of those countries and what they believe to be, some double standards by the West. I can give an example of Zimbabwe, for instance, and how I think most of the leaders there adore or really support heavily Russia, and I don't expect Zimbabwe or the government itself to say anything that will point to the fact that they are unhappy with Russia's aggression against Ukraine. But we need to find a way of, getting everyone to a place where they begin to see defending Ukraine as, something that should not point to the fact that one country is aligning with the West, but it being, an aspect of aligning with principle, for instance, defense of a country's sovereignty, because we all know that that is very important. And for a country like Zambia, for instance, we have walked that path before. We had a long fight for independence and what we needed to do to defend our own sovereignty. So we can't be so indifferent in terms of having another country's independence being trampled upon by another country that we believe should be working closely with that, especially that they are neighbors. So supporting Ukraine is actually an affirmation of values that we need to, hold so dear, and which we have been telling other countries that this is something that we believe in, and we should never, go back on that particular word. So it's quite a lot of things that are at play in terms of those positions and the power play, information power play that is taking place on most of the African countries.
All right. Thank you so much, John. Fernando, I now want to bring you in. And 3 years into the war now, we've moved away from Russia marching its tanks into Ukraine, violating a sovereign country, a country that's fighting back, to this framing where the war is Russia is fighting the West. Russia is fighting EU, Ukraine is not a member of the EU, that Russia is fighting NATO, Ukraine is not a member of NATO, nowhere near joining NATO too. What happened in those 3 years that's drawn the global South into this war? First of all, because we have a past of imperialism and fighting against imperialism, but many countries in the global South do not see Russia as being an imperial power marching onto Ukraine. What happened in those 3 years?
Well, a lot of things happened along these years. There was this is the acceleration of history, the acceleration of change, and this is directly connected with the technological revolution and the pace of change made by technology. But, the problem, what's the problem about? If I look from a strictly Argentine perspective, the war was good for us. It was bad for human rights, but there were two direct consequences that affected positively Argentina. The first one was the commodities price was raised by the war, and we export commodities, and this was bad for the war, good for our economy. And the second one is Europe was not so willing to sign something which is crucial for Argentina and the Mercosur, the European Union-Mercosur agreement. But now Europe has realized that it depended on Russian gas and food from Ukraine, which is a territory in trouble. So the possibilities of the closing the agreement are higher than never before, and this is positive for us. But this is only about, small, narrow perspective, and of course we are speaking about values and principles, and the war was terrible, and that's why our government was in the side of Ukraine from the beginning. Zelensky came to the Milei's inauguration. Milei was awarded with the most important condecoration for Zelensky in Zurich, and I'm the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we did a lot of declarations and communication and video conference between the speakers, between the presidents of the Foreign Affairs Committee, between the parliaments and the network. We are close. The family name of the ambassador, the Ukrainian ambassador in Argentina, I think is Klimenko. But for me, he's Yuri. We work together, and we are together with Ukraine. That's with no. But the problem, what's the problem about? So the problem about is Russia. Russia. I remember a phrase. In 2007, I published a book about Argentinian politics, but there is nothing more Argentine than Russian. And I used it as the epigraph, a phrase of Pushkin, who was something like, I'm sorry, I'm translating from Russian to Spanish, but it was something like, God doesn't allow again the immisericord, the brutal Russian nightmare. And this is what we are. Russia has 4 types of neighbor countries. Those that were invaded by the Tsars, those that were invaded by Stalin, those that were invaded by Putin, and those that were invaded by all of them. And this is the real problem. This is the old dream of a Russian empire. And this is what is very clear for us from the global south, let's say, the imperialism. And I'm not speaking about, you know, general hegemony and good hegemons and soft imperialism based on agreements. And I'm speaking about real imperialism, you know. The army is there, they put a regime, so we are in Prague. We don't have to say so much about Russian imperialism by the Soviet, by the Stalin, by the Tsar, by whoever. And this is the real problem. And I think Europe is in trouble because this is something which is completely asynchronous. Let me say this. Europe was maybe the only continent that was really living in the 21st century. Maybe some other parts of the world, but the Europeans were living the 21st century in terms of human rights, welfare, etc. They were worried about animals, you know. And I respect this, you know, vegans and the campaign for the rights of the cows, and that's okay. I'm not mocking on this, but this is an agenda. This is being at the 21st century, dreaming on the 22nd century, you know. And it's okay. But then somebody knocked on the door and say, oh, hey, man, we are again in the 20th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. So awake, please. And this is a real problem for Europe, to awake to the real world in which we are right now. Maybe 1930, maybe. So look, think about 1930. There was established colonialism, general colonialism, a big power, which was the United Kingdom, dominating the war. And then there were new powers rising up and questioning the order. There was a big wave of economy going up and all the boats going up and all the countries having progress in economy, 1930. And then Germany and Japan and Italy say, this is unjust, this is imperialism. And they were, in some way, they were right. But the problem is that they were worse than the United Kingdom and the previous hegemony. And now we are facing something very similar. We can say a lot of things about the United States and the order after the Second World War, etc. From the global south, we can criticize many things, you know, Pinochet from South America, and etc., etc. But if you look at the countries which are questioning the existing order, they are worse. And Russia is in the first line. Yeah. So this is something we should think about. I think basically, behind other consideration, the basic thing is we need to put together democracies. We need to fight authoritarianism. It's very clear that we are facing a division in the war with the bad guys, the authoritarian ones, the imperialists, the really imperialist ones in one side, and the other ones. I think the Mercosur European Union agreement is crucial in order to put at least two continents in synchrony and to start a new kind of association in which democracies have to fight for themselves and they have to defend an international order based again in rules and not in power.
All right. Thank you so much, Fernando. You're free to ask questions now. If you have a question at any point, put up your hand. We'll get a microphone to you and you can ask a question. But Shrasti, I want to come to you. Fernando's raised a very important point, which is democracies fighting autocracies. And democracies are clearly outnumbered. Many people are not alive to this fact. There are 91 autocracies in the world, 88 democracies. So they're already outnumbered if you go down to the wire in that regard. Is the framing on the way the war is being fought the problem with getting Global South support to it? Or is just the fact that Russia is good with disinformation networks making it very hard for Global South to have a simple framing towards the war?
Well, it's a complex question, as you know. I mean, it's a very nuanced question in its own way. So the first thing is, let me start with the second part. When you say that, we'll come to the democracy versus autocracy later, but the first part, we have to sort of understand that Russia, for decades, has been extremely successful with a certain propaganda all over the world, especially when America was busy fighting something in Iraq and Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. So, and it is very entrenched. So there are certain things that I would like to highlight. For example, have you noticed, I mean, in my country, I noticed how Soviet Union, now the usage or the reference to Soviet Union is very subtly changed to Soviet Russia, which is completely wrong because Soviet Union, during Soviet Union times, Ukraine was a part of Soviet Union. In fact, if I talk about my country, India, after we became independent, of course, we were always socialist leanings, we were non-aligned, but the socialist leanings. So in the initial building of our nation, we had Soviet engineers, which had Ukrainian engineers as well. But somehow, and this is just a small example, I can give you many examples, but for the paucity of time, let me just come to the main point, which is that there have been decades by which Russia has been able to successfully appropriate the legacy of the Soviet Union and othered everybody else, So India, first of all, that is one problem. So India really genuinely believes that Russia is the sole successor of the Soviet Union and probably the most authentic representative of the Soviet Union, which is frankly not the case. Even going back in our history, we see that that's not the case. Second, the Russian propaganda is extremely entrenched. So this is not a war between Russia and Ukraine. This is not a war of territorial aggression. This is a war of Russia versus West. It is there. It is very difficult to fight it. Please understand it is from India's perspective. India is a country that is fighting border disputes on both sides of our borders, with Pakistan and with China. Just as I'm speaking today, China is claiming 90,000 square kilometers of my territory in one sector of the LAC, our border, and China is claiming 48,000 square kilometers of our territory in another sector of our border. And China is sitting illegally on 5,100 square kilometers of my territory today. And yet, you see that Russia has been able to successfully convince India that this is actually not a territorial aggression. This is basically Russia versus West because somewhere we have become very attuned to this idea that Russia has a genuine concern, quote unquote, that it needs to be surrounded by buffer states. And if it is not surrounded by buffer states, it doesn't feel safe. Now, this is a ridiculous argument because nobody has touched Russian territory. And so there are many, many ways to look at it. One is that why is it so successful? So one is Russian propaganda. Now, very quickly, just coming to the second part about democracies versus autocracies. I do find that a lot of people in the West find it strange because when they speak to Indians and they feel that, since India is a democracy, since India is a post-colonial state, it would have the necessary sensitivity to understand that Ukraine is also fighting the last imperial war. But somehow this doesn't cut ice because, unfortunately, when I look at the state of Indian democracy, I feel that the argument which is rooted or framed in this democracy versus autocracies doesn't fly in a country like India. What flies in a country like India is interests. And that is how I try to argue, saying that this war has direct implications for us. Like I mentioned, the weapon supplies are changing. And by the way, there is no doubt in India, when we look at this war and this theater, we see that a true 2 trillion economy is fighting a 30 trillion bloc and is still successfully winning the war of narrative and propaganda. So there is something which is intrinsically wrong that you have to rectify apart from fighting on the battlefield. And just my last point is that after spending 3.5 hours studying, struggling, challenging Russian propaganda in so many ways, I teach European security. That is what I was doing for the MOD think tank. And a lot of resistance I faced because of, our traditional ties. And my point was simple. We have to dehyphenate, our ties with the West, with Europe, with Ukraine, they stand on their own, and our ties with Russia must stand on their own. What I see today is that Russia has already, when I look at returns to scale, it has becoming more and more diminishing. Because if the longer the war goes on, and this is one very important part for at least, let's say, a country like India that is in South Asia, etc., From our perspective, and I can probably speak on the behalf of others, but at least on my behalf, from our perspective, it doesn't cut ice whether Russia, after 4 years, 5 years, whatever, because they are fighting a war of grinding attrition. Okay, so at the end of it, and I hope the end is soon, whether they are able to win the 18%, 90% of land, or whether they are able to lose it, I mean, that frankly doesn't really impact India. What impacts India is that in the process, it is getting itself entrenched with China in a manner which has security implications for India. In that process, it is getting completely it is shrinking from its sphere of influence in the Middle East, in the Caucasus. I don't know how many of you here know that India became the largest weapon supplier to Armenia because Russia was so entrenched in the war in Ukraine that it just couldn't really support Armenia. So, like I said, that India is aware of these things. And ultimately, yes, there is a successful propaganda that it is impossible to defeat Russia on its home turf. And I think that will run its own course. And Ukraine is doing a lot for it already. But from our perspective, I think democracy versus autocracies doesn't fly. What flies is speak about interests.
Okay, thank you. Bakari, if I could come to you, and then we'll ask the audience to ask questions. I see there's a lady here, so we'll get a microphone to you, and the gentleman there. So, Bakari, on the interests question, some African countries have realized that the framing of the war and the way in which it might come to an end is if incentive structures are built, and they've moved to the center and started to hedge between the West and Russia and China and other countries there. And in this hedging, they've made a multilateral order become impossible. It's become just impossible because countries are now being transactional. Do you think that we're heading more into that direction of transactionalism in which many African countries might also engage just to get economic incentives to improve their own countries? Or do you think that we need to have a multilateral order in which, incentives are distributed not in a transactional manner?
Okay, thank you. Differently from India or other countries, we are so far from the physical front. We are in Africa, but we are really involved in the values front. The issue is democracy. We see a country, big country like Russia, occupying another one and trying also in the meantime to transfer this conflict in our soil in Africa by using Wagner, Africa Corp, etc., etc. It's a threat from the value we have in common. I'm saying that yes, the issue now is how to extract this conflict from the confrontation between the West and the East and to put it in a framework of values. Even our European partners are not very credible when it has come to values. They change from their interest, from their anything. I say often that the credibility of a message is depending on the messenger. And the best messengers for the cause of Ukraine now, I think as Ukrainians themselves, European Union can decide to put the Ukrainian at, a champion in this cause when it's come to talk to the African and the global South. And I think that it will be a good solution for us to better understand this. Otherwise, we'll say, okay, today they attack Ukraine, it's very far from here, and they are attacking us by coming with Wagner, exploiting the resources, causing some conflict, discriminating some Fulani people in Mali, in Burkina Faso, and exporting this conflict when we know that Africa is it's not very important for Russia, except if Russia needs Africa as a ground in order to disturb or to fight against the West. So we are a variable of balancing for Russia. Yeah. And we have to be very careful in this narrative saying that it's far from us. It is a confrontation between the West and the East and Russia. And the issue is now the struggle about the values. And I know that the civil society has a very huge role to play in a kind of P2P diplomacy in order to better understand, because there are something, occupation, colonization, we know that makes sense from the African perspective, and we can share some strategies in terms of communication in order to be more involved in defending democracy and defending freedom and defending this principle of defending its soil against occupation, against colonization.
All right, thank you so much, Bakari. So yes, there's a lady here. There is another lady here. Okay, just 1 minute, tell us who you are and your question and where it's to you.
I'm Alexandra Gormazhapova, I'm from Russia. I have a question from expert from Zambia. You told that about expert students who now are in Russia. What do you think? They don't know about racism in Russia? You know, it's very big level. For example, I grew up in St. Petersburg. I'm citizen of Russian Federation, but I always listen, go to home, go to China, etc. And now we know a lot of indigenous people who were sent to the war against Ukraine because they are very poorest. Maybe your student live in bubble, or maybe why you don't know and they don't know about racism and xenophobia and chauvinism in Russia and colonial mindset. Thank you.
All right, thank you. There's a lady at the front here. And then we'll go to the back. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Vesna Posic from Croatia. First of all, congratulations. It was really a fascinating discussion and panel to listen to. And especially the African perspective, which I always suspected that the Russian propaganda actually succeeded to present the war against Ukraine as the war against the West.
Yeah.
Although, Ukraine is not West, and in all honesty, in European Union, the countries that are most threatened by this are not France or Great Britain or Italy. It's the countries that were former Soviet Union, the Balts, and then some of the countries of Eastern Central Europe. But because I was at the beginning very shocked by the fact that African countries and peoples didn't understand colonization, and this is what's happening there, and didn't understand infringement on somebody else's territory. And I really suspected this, but now really learned firsthand from you that this was presented in such a way that you didn't really think of Ukraine. You thought of the imperial powers that of the past, and why shouldn't they be put into their place? So I think that in that sense, this is also a message to the Forum 2000. This is something because the Forum 2000 has been from the beginning asking us to give them something concrete that the forum could do. This is something very, very specific and also very important in general for security. And certainly Africa can understand, the Wagner terrorists that have been running around in Africa and everything. So Forum 2000 could maybe use this insight that you provided to organize people-to-people contacts between African civil society and African countries, people from African countries, and Ukraine, and maybe also the Balts, but Ukraine in particular. So thank you very much for that.
All right, thank you. The lady right there, and then the gentleman at the back, yes. Well, I'm coming to you, and then I'll come to this side too, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Moira Suazo from the Public University in Bolivia. I have a question more for Frau Svasti Rao. I was thinking, you mentioned this border conflict between India and China. And I was thinking about, I have the feeling that we are in a transition period between the old order, it's dying, and a new order is emerging. And when we think about now, what is getting old, maybe you can say that is this multilateralism and a world based in rules. And we are looking at the conflict, at the invasion of Ukraine. We are looking at the borders are being erased, are being moved by force. And I would like to know your opinion if these facts are seen in the Indian society.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman
at the back
in the middle there, and then we'll have the lady here. I'm trying to have as many of you as possible, so we still have time. Yes.
Thank you. Ted Picone from the Club of Madrid and Brookings. And I was one of those naive researchers who had hoped that with democracy evolving in places like India and Brazil and South Africa, that there would be a change in their foreign policies. And I've been proven wrong. But maybe we can stipulate a couple things. All countries act first on their interests, not their values. And there is hypocrisy and double standards across the board. We're all guilty of that. So now, very much building off of this last question, it's not so much in my mind now about democracy and autocracy, but this core principle of territorial sovereignty and non-interference and invasion from another power. So flagrantly and clearly violated by Russia in Ukraine. And this is so important to the Global South and many other countries that they've stood for. This is why we need a strong international rules-based order to protect ourselves against the big powers. And yet, this principle seems not to be front and center in your diplomats' minds or your country's positions on this conflict. Please help explain.
Okay. All right. Thank you. The lady here and then the gentleman. We'll start with the lady and then we'll come to the gentleman.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for this panel and for your insights. My name is Tatiana Pachonchik. I'm Ukrainian. I came from Kyiv, and I represent the Human Rights Center Zmina. We are a human rights organization, and I would like to refer to what Bakari said about how important it is for people in the Western Africa, but I believe far beyond, to know deeper and to have experience what is happening in Ukraine, what are the roots of this war and its implications. And we, as representatives of the Ukrainian civil society, try to deliver this information. I was traveling by myself to Nigeria, Ghana, and Brazil, and my colleagues also visited other countries, but in comparison with the Russian propaganda, with all that flow of information, our work is a drop in the ocean. And I think what is even more important is that not only we are coming to Africa, Asia, South America, but also we invite leaders of public opinion, civil society representatives, universities, media, religious leaders, cultural figures to Ukraine to explain them and to show from inside what is happening and what are the roots and causes of this war and how it might evolve. We decided several years ago to establish in Ukraine a constant forum, platform for such exchange between civil society of Ukraine, but also including representatives of authorities and other institutions, and our peers, our colleagues from Asia, Africa, Latin America, other countries. This is called Crimea Global Conference. It has Crimea in the title because everything started from Crimea, and we start to explain that we have to understand this through the South, and then we explain how it evolved. And besides the conference, it also includes a lot of regional trips with very deep experience. So I'm very glad to see here Swasti Rao, who participated in one of such conferences. And this year in mid-November, we will have a third one. It will be for a week in mid-November. So I would like to say that we are very much interested to bring you to Ukraine, and especially those who never visited our country and who would like to do so. and to show you everything, to arrange you meetings with victims of this war, to show you other aspects, how it affects the economy, both Ukraine and globally, about security, about culture, about everything. So those of you who are interested to come to Ukraine, please, I invite you, come approach me, and we will try to arrange it in the future. Thank you. For us as Ukrainians, it is very important.
Thank you so much. I know that Shvasti might take that invitation. The gentleman, okay, gentleman and then the lady here. But first the gentleman, because his hand has been up for some time.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Maxim Lorzhevsky. I'm from the EP think tank, the think tank on foreign affairs and security. And I wanted to ask regarding the last event that happened 1 month ago. It was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. And after that, the substantive communique was signed, which included the economic cooperation, investments, and so on in global south countries. And what I wanted to ask is whether this summit may somehow change the attitude of the global south towards the war in Ukraine, and also to make the question more specific, especially for Ms. Rao, because we know that there is a specific strategic balancing act that India undertakes to balance between superpowers. How it can especially influence the Indian stance towards war in Ukraine? Thank you.
All right. Very finally.
Which summit were you referring to when you started?
The Shanghai Cooperation.
The Shanghai SCO. Okay.
CEO.
Hi, thank you. I'm Katia Bashidze from Georgia, a country that has also been fighting Russian colonialism and imperialism since the 18th century and still ongoing. What would you like the supporters of Ukraine's struggle for their future, but also for the future of many of us, depending directly on the outcome of what happens in Ukraine, to do or stop doing to have more support amongst your communities for this cause of fight against Russian colonialism? Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think we'll come back. Yes, yeah. I think we need to come back because we've got very little time left, and I want to give each of you at least 2 minutes to respond to some of those questions. So I think I'll start with Bakari, and then we'll go and end with John. So Bakari, just in 2 minutes, respond, make a response to Sab.
Ukraine needs everybody. But Ukraine needs European Union, Ukraine needs NATO for many initiatives, but as a champion itself, from the Ukrainian people, from the Ukrainian civil society organization. My understanding of this conflict begins with when I hosted last year an intern who is originally from Georgia, but he's Ukrainian in the meantime, but living in the US. And it was my first contact with some people who can tell me what exactly happening there. I think that we, beside all this engagement of our state who vote in the General Assembly in the UN, etc., we have to go back to the common values like democracy, and so in the communication, last word is to emphasize on things that make sense for the Africans. Colonialism, we know. Domination, we know. And we know also what is this threat of people who want to colonize and to occupy your territory. And the second thing is democracy. I know that people are doubted about democracy. People try now, with the Russian propaganda, to say that, no, African now, they reject democracy. It's not true. If you see the Afrobarometer figures, 82% of Africans want to live under democratic regime. But the problem was how some Western countries decredibilize the democratic principle with their interests, etc., etc. So there is, from this forum, to have a democratic coalition against colonialism and against occupation, even in Ukraine, even in Gaza, even in Africa and everywhere. The more important are the principles and not just the interests, the immediate interests. But the global interest for us is to live in a world of peace and equality and respect. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Bakari. Shwasti.
So I'll try to be brief. There's so many questions addressed to me. One about the India-China and this territorial question and all. See, there is no doubt about the fact that when we say the rules-based order, one of the biggest beneficiaries of the rules-based orders have been the countries that were post-colonial, because the rules-based orders ensured that their borders will not be changed by force. So when you look at it from that prism, there is absolutely no doubt about the fact that India has not even in principle agreed or supported the annexation of Crimea. India has always, in its communication with Ukraine, has always said that, territorial integrity and UN Charter, because India is a sufferer at the hands of China. But at the same time, I will not shy away from saying that this is where the hypocrisy of the Global South also comes. That a lot of times, the same rules-based order that has worked for them, when they want to defend a certain aggression, they would say, oh, the rules-based order, but who made those rules? We didn't make those rules. So there is a perpetuity of that hypocrisy which continues, and this is the reality of the world we live in. India has enemy setting on its borders, and yet India is not able to condemn Russia for invading another sovereign country, and is constantly looking for justifications to sort of regurgitate the Russian propaganda, saying it's security, NATO eastward expansion. It's ridiculous. I teach European security. I work on it. I know that that's not true. Having said that, what I would like to, my message would be that instead of sort of constantly nitpicking on that point, because please understand that we have also been using Russia to balance against China. Okay, and if you look at it from the lens of the prism, from the prism of national interest, I think you do understand, we all understand that there are nuances. So it's better to talk in terms of interest. And that's my short answer. It can be a very long answer, but he has given me 2 minutes. So about that, okay, so there's no doubt about it. Secondly, when you say SEO, I think you asked me a question on that. India, under the prevailing circumstances of how India is finding itself getting cornered because of Donald Trump administration and what Donald Trump has done to completely throw the India-US strategic partnership under the bus by constantly undermining India and its, position. It was, we put together that relationship with a lot of hard work in the last 25 years. So if you understand India, India's foreign policy of multi-alignment is, this is how it operates. So we use Russia to balance against the West, and we use the West to balance against Russia. Now we don't have a unified or a collective West. Now we have a more multipolar West itself. So there is US on the one hand, but there's Europe on the other hand. So India now has a different strategic semantics when it comes to US, Europe, Russia, China, etc. India's involvement in SCO and BRICS, please understand it with the lens of the fact that whenever United States has withdrawn from a particular theater in our neighborhood, that power vacuum has been usurped by China. And to basically balance against that, we have to make sure that we remain in these, these platforms, because we also project ourselves as the leaders of the so-called Global South, and we compete with China with that. Yes. So this is less got to do with, anti-Western, pro-Western, and more got to do with the fact of power vacuum. And just my last point, because there's so many questions, so please, 30 seconds, Raymond. My last point is that, we can just go on. I think when you ask about, our colleague from Zamina said, how do you change? Or I think you also asked this question. I honestly feel that the real question here is not this unending story about democracy and why don't you believe in values and etc. The real story is that from the perspective of countries of the Global South, let's say, the problem is that Russia has been successful in entrenching into our minds that Ukraine doesn't have agency. Georgia doesn't have agency. Ukraine is a CIA project. Georgia is a CIA project. And I think the real thing that Ukrainians can do for themselves, which they're doing very successfully, is that they are telling and reclaiming that they have agency. And that is the reason why a war, which was supposed to end in 3 days, 5 days, 10 days, that was my assessment too, has been going on for 3.5 years and is going to go on longer. Reclaim your agency. I think that is the only big success story that you can do. The rest is going to follow. So the narrative building will follow.
All right. Thank you, Shwasti. Fernando, if I could get you in 2 minutes also to respond. It's so very difficult, but attempt.
Well, the first reflection is about poverty. When I was young, long time ago, poverty was Asian. Bangladesh concert, the Beatles. And now we are speaking about China dominating Africa. So this is a first reflection about the consequences of different policies. Among all the particular characteristic, Asia opened it to the world, China, for instance. And Africa remained closed with an ideology which was a mix of anti-colonialism, but third worldism, and and nationalism, and so. The consequences are this: we are speaking about a national power dominating or being crucial, because it's Russia, but it's basically China in Africa. So think about how much the capacity of opening to the world is vital for the Global South. Second consideration, yes, they have an agency. And if I have to say, they have also an organization, which is the BRICS. BRICS is basically China and Russia. What about India? What about Brazil? This is crucial. What are going to be in this tension between autocracies and democracies? It's very clear the position of Russia and China. But it's not so clear the position of China and Brazil. For us, in South America, it's crucial the agreement with the European Union, because if not, Mercosur is going to disintegrate, and Brazil is going directly to be with the BRICS, and Argentina is going to be directly with the United States, and that's it. That's the end of regional integration and so on. That's crucial. And this is also about values, the question of interests or values. We are living in a world in which predominated the idea of interest. This was the cleavest mind for some bodies in international affairs in the world, which was Kissinger. Kissinger had this idea: let's put China inside the frame. They are going to have a prosperous economy and so on, and they are going to be democratic at the end. Well, Kissinger was not so clever on that, at least today, to the present date. So it's about both things. That's what is so important, the agreement, and to start something, because we are questioning about the position of India and Brazil in future, but the tension between democracy and autocracy is also inside our countries. And this is also the 30s. There were Nazis at the United Kingdom. There was a big movement, Nazi movement, inside democratic countries like the United Kingdom. Lindbergh, remember Lindbergh, the pilot, he was a candidate to, there is a novel about Lindbergh becoming the president of the United States and being Nazi, etc., etc. So it's also about values. We had to make a new, so United Nations say it's not about democracy. Let's be together because we have to manage we have to avoid the war. And they were successful. But the consequence that were an international order in which democracies are getting rare. And the European Union has had another policy. If you want to be part of the market, you have to be democratic. And they had very democratic consequences, particularly in the South, in the European South, not the Global South, the European South, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece. So I think we should think about rebuilding some kind of alliance of democracies. United Nations were born not in 1945, they were born in 1943 with the declaration of the United Nations. Again, they were the allies that were fighting against totalitarianism. We should think in something similar, and maybe this agreement between Europe and the Mercosur is a good first stage.
All right, thank you, Fernando. John, if I could come to you now.
I would try, like very, very quick because of time. I think just building up from what he said, on the aspect of building alliances for democracy. I'll also just relate to what was said. I can't remember her name, on a proposal for Forum 2000 to try and bring people together to understand deeply what's going on and push a narrative that will make people understand the real truth that is going on in Ukraine. I think my addition to that is we also just need to strengthen the capacity of the African journalists to tell the story on what is going on, because there are some lapses there depending on what kind of information they come across. So they have to do that through their own lenses, but of course with some moral clarity on what's happening, which I think builds on what he had said earlier. There's also need to just highlight not just the geopolitical context, but the human suffering, because there are millions of people that have been displaced, the journalists that have been silenced, and I think those are our everyday cries, and journalists, and there are civilians that are also being killed, very innocent civilians. And people also have to understand that defending the truth and justice in Ukraine strengthens our own struggles for press freedom. We have a number of issues that are going on in Africa, and I think when we extend that to just highlight what is going on there, we are also strengthening our own capacities to have bigger voices that will speak on our behalf. Then calls for peace have to be genuine and must not come at the expense of justice. There's also need for lasting stability that should depend on upholding international law and ensuring accountability for war crimes and aggression. I think that's also one very important part. And lastly, some diplomatic voices that can come from countries like Zambia, for instance, that has always been speaking about the diplomacy and on how to handle some of these things. They have to play a constructive role, not through neutrality, which unfortunately has been the case for a number of our countries, but taking up some leadership that will insist on respect for sovereignty and human rights as a non-negotiable foundation for peace in our global world. And I think lastly, there was a question that was very specific about some of the Zambian students that are studying in Russia and whether or not they are aware of some of the racism that's going on. I wouldn't be wrong to say they actually know, but I think most of them are being managed by the fact that there are those relations that have been there that the Zambian government, for instance, wouldn't want to, destroy in the process of having a number of students studying in Russia. I'll give you quick examples of something that points to that fact. There are two students, one from Zambia and another from Tanzania, that were lost in the war against Ukraine. They were drafted into that war from prisons, where at some point they found themselves on the other side of the law. They were sentenced and jailed, and unfortunately, the boss of Wagner personally recruited them into the war, and they were taken to the front lines, but they did not last. I think within 2 weeks of them fighting on behalf of Russia against Ukraine, they were killed. Those are the two serious stories that, to this day, are still very topical in terms of how people view Russia's approach in terms of respect for the students that come from the African countries. So I think that's my
All right.
point.
Thank you so much. And please, a round of applause for my panelists who've done a very good job. It's very difficult to get the entire Global South, but thank you so much to everyone also who's been here. And I will give you a few of the takeaways that we've had. The war is about territorial sovereignty. I think that has been one of the takeaways. Allow Ukrainian voices to continuously make the point that the war is about territorial sovereignty and that Ukrainians are fighting back. Post-colonial countries are also beneficiaries of the rules-based order and are ready to defend it, so I think you should take them on as partners. Fernando did mention a new order against authoritarianism needs to be found between the Global South and the Global North, and then a respect for the Global South interest on the global stage. I think that's the point Shvasti has been making over and over. So thank you so much, everyone who's been part of this panel, and see you on the outside. Thank you. I think we need to take a picture here for the...